the night the Whitmore house went quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that meant peace. It was the kind that meant someone was listening, someone was hiding, and somewhere behind a locked door, a girl's breath was being stolen. By sunrise, the plantation owner would be dead. Not poisoned, not shot. Found on the kitchen floor, collapsed in a pool of his own secrets. And when the sheriff demanded to know who did it, an enslaved mother stepped forward into the lantern light and said, "I did." But the part that shook the plantation wasn't the confession. It was her reason. Block 1. The House That Smiled. Charleston County, South Carolina, 1847. From the road, Whitmore Plantation looked almost peaceful. White columns, clean fences, cotton fields stretching so far they blurred into the horizon. But inside the big house, everything moved in. The woman named Mara had learned that early. She wasn't loud, she wasn't reckless. She moved through rooms like a shadow, present, useful, and never fully seen. Mara came to Whitmore when she was 13. She didn't remember the exact date. What she remembered was the smell of damp wood and rusted iron, and the way the air below deck tasted like panic. She learned quickly that survival had rules. Crying didn't change anything. Silence did. Years folded into each other. She grew into strong hands, careful eyes, and a mind that quietly studied danger. The kitchen became her world. Heat, knives, heavy pots, and the steady rhythm of doing exactly what was expected. The man who owned that kitchen was a gentleman in town, Caleb Whitmore. He wasn't the kind of master who shouted. That was what made him worse. He smiled often. He spoke softly. His punishments were calm, almost polite. On Whitmore Plantation, fear didn't always arrive with yelling. Sometimes it arrived with a quiet voice and a hand resting too long on your shoulder. Mara had a daughter. Her name was Lena, 16 years old. Long-limbed, quick-eyed, and growing into a beauty that didn't belong to her, because nothing on that land was allowed to belong to itself. No one ever asked who Lena's father was. Questions like that were dangerous. Mara protected her the only ways she could. She taught Lena how to move through the yard without drawing attention, how to keep her head down without looking broken, how to listen carefully when powerful men were speaking. And at night, when the house finally slept, Mara did something dangerous. She taught her daughter letters, scraps of newspaper, a torn Bible page, the back of an old ledger sheet thrown away from the study. Mara did not read well, but she knew enough. Enough was power. Enough was a door. Lena would trace the shapes with her finger, whispering the sounds slowly. Mara watched the doorway the entire time. Because on a plantation, knowledge was not just forbidden, it was threatening. Then something began to change. Not suddenly, quietly. Caleb Whitmore started finding reasons to appear near the kitchen. Sometimes he leaned in the doorway while Mara worked, smiling as if he had wandered there by accident. Sometimes he asked small questions, unnecessary questions. How old is the girl now? Does she still help with the washing? Does she go down to the river often? Mara answered carefully, head bowed, voice steady. But inside, she was counting how long his eyes stayed on Lena, counting how often his footsteps returned, counting the slow shift in the air, like the sky just before a storm. One evening, as supper simmered in a heavy iron pot, Mara heard laughter from the back corridor. Not warm laughter, mocking. Then suddenly, silence. The kind of silence that makes your hands stop moving. She set the spoon down. listened. A muffled sound followed. Small, strangled, like someone trying to breathe through a hand. Mara wiped her palms on her apron. Her heart had already started racing. She stepped into the hallway, bare feet on cold wooden boards. At the far end of the corridor, the storage room door stood slightly open. A thin strip of lantern light spilled across the floor, and from inside, another quiet struggle. Mara swallowed once. Then she walked toward the door. Mara stopped a few steps from the storage room door. From inside came the sound again. A chair scraping slightly across wood. A breath that wasn't free. Her hand rested against the wall as she listened. Then a voice. Caleb Whitmore's voice. Low, calm. The same tone he used at the dinner table when speaking about weather or cotton prices. Now, there's no reason to struggle. The words crawled down Mara's spine like ice. For a moment, her body refused to move. Every lesson she had ever learned on this land screamed the same warning inside her head. Do not interfere. Do not anger the master. Do not make yourself visible. But another sound came from inside the room, a small, trapped sob. And Mara knew that sound better than any voice on earth. Lena. Her hand tightened slowly into a fist. The house around her felt suddenly too quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. Inside the room, Caleb spoke again. You've grown since last summer. A pause. Pretty things attract attention, girl. That's the way of the world. Lena's voice trembled, barely louder than breath. Please, sir. The word sir sounded like a stone in Mara's chest. Years of discipline tried to hold her in place. Years of survival whispered the same command. Walk away. Pretend you heard nothing. That was how people lived long on plantations. But something inside Mara had already begun to break. Slowly, carefully, she moved closer to the door. Through the narrow opening, she could see the edge of the storage room lantern. Shelves of flour sacks, a shadow moving across the wall. And then, Lena's arm, pinned against the wooden table. Caleb stood close behind her, one hand gripping her wrist, the other hand resting against her shoulder. Too familiar, too certain. Lena's face turned slightly toward the door. Her eyes were wide, not crying, frozen. And when those eyes met Mara's, time seemed to stop. For 1 second, the room held 3 people who all understood the same truth. Caleb followed her gaze. He turned his head slowly toward the doorway. And when he saw Mara standing there, he smiled. Not surprised, not ashamed, amused. Well, he said quietly, so the girl's mother has come. Lena tried to pull away again, but Caleb's grip tightened. His voice stayed calm. Go back to the kitchen, Mara. The way he said her name felt like ownership. This does not concern you. The words hung in the air, heavy, certain. For years, Mara had survived by lowering her eyes when that voice spoke, by stepping backward, by becoming smaller. But something had changed the moment she saw Lena's face. Fear was still there, but it had been joined by something older, something deeper. The kind of instinct that lives in the bones of every mother who has ever stood between danger and her child. Mara held Caleb's gaze, and for the first time in 17 years on Whitmore Plantation, she did not lower her eyes. The silence stretched. Caleb's smile faded slightly. Did you not hear me? He asked. Mara's voice came out steady. I heard you. Another pause. Then she stepped backward. Just once, turning away from the door, walking slowly down the corridor. To Caleb Whitmore, It looked like obedience. Inside the storage room, Lena's shoulders sagged with helpless despair. Caleb chuckled softly. "You see," he said to her, "even your own mother knows her place." But what Caleb Whitmore did not know, what he could not see, was Mara moving through the dark hallway toward the kitchen. Her breathing had slowed. Her hands were steady. And in the quiet kitchen, waiting beside the heavy cutting board, was the butcher knife used to carve thick slabs of meat. The blade was not elegant. It did not need to be. Mara wrapped her fingers around the handle. The metal felt cold, solid, final. And then she turned back toward the storage room. The kitchen was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes after a long day. This quiet felt heavy, waiting. The lantern above the cutting board flickered softly, throwing long shadows across the walls. Mara stood there, the butcher knife resting in her hand. Her breathing was slow, controlled. For years, this room had been the center of her life. She had cut meat here, prepared meals for people who would never know her name. But tonight, the weight of the knife felt different. Tonight, it wasn't a kitchen tool. It was a decision. Down the corridor, Lena's voice rose again, a muffled protest. Then Caleb Whitmore's calm voice followed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The words snapped something inside Mara. Memories rushed through her mind. The ship, the chains, the years of swallowing anger just to survive. And above all, Lena, her daughter. Mara tightened her grip on the knife. Then she stepped out of the kitchen. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and silent. Each step made almost no sound. Years of walking barefoot across wooden floors had taught her how to move without being heard. She reached the storage room door again. This time, she did not stop. She pushed it open. The hinges creaked slightly. Caleb Whitmore turned his head. For a moment, his expression showed irritation. Lena stood beside the wooden table, her dress partially torn, her wrist trapped in Caleb's hand. Her face was pale. Her eyes locked instantly with Mara's. Fear filled them. But there was something else now. Hope. Caleb, as if interrupted. "I told you to return to the kitchen." Mara stepped into the room. The lantern light caught the blade in her hand. For the first time, Caleb noticed it. His brow furrowed. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" His voice still carried confidence. The confidence of a man who had never imagined that someone he owned could challenge him. Mara said nothing. Her silence made the room feel smaller. Caleb released Lena's wrist slowly and took a step forward. "You should put that down." Another step. "You don't want to make a mistake you cannot undo." Lena, behind him. "Mama." The word was barely audible, but it was enough. Caleb turned slightly toward her. That small movement exposed his back for a second, and Mara moved. The knife drove forward with sudden force. The blade buried itself deep between Caleb's ribs. For a moment, he didn't scream. He gasped. Shock spread across his face as he looked down at the handle in his chest. Mara pulled the blade free. Caleb stumbled forward. Lena scrambled away toward the wall. "You..." The word broke apart in his throat. He turned toward Mara again, disbelief twisting his face. Not pain, disbelief. As if the world itself had broken its rules. Mara stepped forward once more. The second strike landed higher. This time Caleb cried out. But Mara did not stop. Strike. Breath. Strike. Breath. until the man who owned Whitmore Plantation collapsed heavily onto the wooden floor. The lantern light flickered over spreading blood. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound left in the room was Mara's breathing. Slow, controlled. The knife slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull metal sound. Across the room, Lena trembled violently. "Mama!" Mara crossed the room and pulled her daughter into her arms. Lena clung to her, shaking. "It's all right, Mara." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. On a plantation, killing a master was not just murder. It was war. Outside the house, the night remained quiet. For now. But it would not stay that way for long. Soon someone would hear the noise. Soon the body would be discovered. Soon every man on Whitmore land would come looking for answers. Mara held Lena tightly for one last moment. Then she pulled her daughter back and placed her hands on Lena's shoulders. Her voice became firm. "You must run." Lena shook her head immediately. "No, you must." Mara's eyes locked onto hers. "There is an old oak tree by the river. Hide there. Do not come back until I find you." Tears rolled down Lena's face, but she understood. Mara pushed a loose strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "Live," she lived, "no matter what happens to me." Lena ran. Her footsteps faded quickly into the darkness beyond the house. Mara turned slowly back toward the body on the floor. Caleb Whitmore lay motionless now. The great master of the plantation, reduced to silence. Mara wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her dress, and walked toward the front door, because she already knew what she was going to do next. She was going to tell them the truth. The night air outside the house felt colder than before. Mara stepped down from the front porch slowly, the lantern light from the windows stretching across the yard. In the distance, the quarters were settling into their usual silence. Men returning from the fields, women finishing the last tasks of the evening. The plantation was breathing the way it always did at night, unaware that something inside the big house had just changed forever. For a moment, Mara stood alone in the yard. She could have run. The woods behind the fields were dark enough. The river paths were known to her. If she moved fast enough, she might disappear before the body was discovered. But Mara knew the truth. They would hunt. And when they hunted, they would punish everyone. The men in the quarters, the women, the children. A master's death never belonged to one person. It belonged to the entire plantation. So instead of running, Mara walked forward. Lanterns were appearing across the yard as workers returned toward the cabins. One of the overseers noticed her first. His name was Harlan Pike. "What are you doing out here this late?" he called. Mara stopped beneath the lantern hanging near the yard post. The warm light illuminated her face. There was blood on the edge of her sleeve. Harlan frowned immediately. "Where is Mr. Whitmore?" Mara's voice came out steady. "He is in the storage room." Something in her tone made the overseer uneasy. Harlan grabbed a lantern and marched toward the house with two other men behind him. Mara did not move. From the yard, she could hear their footsteps crossing the hallway. Then, a sudden shout. Another voice followed. "What in God's name?" Boots rushed across the floor. Within seconds, the yard erupted into noise. Lanterns swung wildly. Men shouted orders. Then Harlan Pike burst out the front door. His face had gone pale. He scanned the yard until his eyes found Mara standing exactly where she had been. "You!" he barked. "What happened in there?" Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Enslaved workers, overseers, stable hands, everyone waiting for the answer. For years, Mara had been invisible to them, just another woman who moved quietly through the kitchen. But now every eye on Whitmore Plantation was fixed on her. The yard fell silent. Mara lifted her chin slightly. "I did it." The words moved through the crowd like a sudden wind. Several people, one of the overseers. Harlan stepped forward slowly. "You what?" Mara did not flinch. "I killed him." For a moment, no one spoke. The idea seemed too large to accept. An enslaved woman, a kitchen worker, standing calmly in the lantern light and admitting to the death of the man who owned them all. Harlan's face twisted with rage. He raised his whip. The lash cracked across Mara's shoulder, but she did not cry out. She barely moved. That silence unsettled the men more than screaming would have. Harlan grabbed the front of her dress and pulled her closer. "Why?" he demanded. Mara looked directly into his eyes. Her answer was simple. "He touched my daughter." The words dropped into the yard like a stone. Murmurs spread instantly. Some of the white men exchanged uneasy glances. Others scowled angrily. The enslaved workers said nothing, but their silence carried a different weight now. Harlan released her slowly. If what she said was true, the story would not stay inside these fences. Charleston was a town built on reputation. A scandal like this could travel fast. After a tense moment, Harlan pointed toward the smokehouse. "Lock her inside until morning." Two men grabbed Mara by the arms. They dragged her across the yard toward the small wooden building near the edge of the fields. The door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled of ash and salted meat. They tied her wrists to a wooden beam and slammed the door shut. Darkness swallowed the room. Outside, the plantation buzzed with chaos. Horses being saddled, messengers riding toward town, voices arguing about what should happen next. But inside the smokehouse, everything was quiet again. Mara leaned her head back against the beam. Pain from the whip burned across her shoulder. Yet her thoughts were somewhere else, out near the river, where a frightened 16-year-old girl was hiding beneath an old oak tree. Mara closed her eyes. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. Because whatever happened at sunrise, Lena was still alive, and that was enough. By morning, the entire county would know Whitmore Plantation had lost its master, and the woman responsible was waiting in chains. Dawn arrived slowly over Whitmore Plantation. A pale gray light crept across the fields, touching the cotton rows one by one, as if the land itself was waking carefully, uncertain of what it would find. But the house already knew. Inside the front parlor, Caleb Whitmore's body lay where the men had carried it during the night. A sheet had been placed over his chest, though the dark stain beneath it continued to spread through the fabric. The master of Whitmore Plantation, silent. Outside, the yard was no longer quiet. Word had traveled faster than anyone expected. By sunrise, riders were already moving along the road toward Charleston. Neighbors would soon hear the story, and stories like this never stayed small. The sheriff arrived just after the sun cleared the trees. His name was Daniel Cross, a heavy man with tired eyes and a reputation for keeping order where order was profitable. He stepped down from his horse slowly, studying the plantation yard before entering the house. Inside, the overseers spoke all at once. The body, the knife, the woman in the smokehouse, and the accusations she had made. Sheriff Cross said little. He simply listened. When they finished, he asked one quiet question. "Where is she?" Minutes later, the smokehouse door creaked open. Morning light flooded the small room. Mara blinked once as the sheriff stepped inside. Her wrists were still tied to the wooden beam. Her face showed no panic, only exhaustion. Cross studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You say you killed Caleb Whitmore?" "Yes." "And you claim he attacked your daughter?" "Yes." The sheriff's gaze lingered on her a little longer. He had seen many killers in his career, men who lied, men who wept, men who begged. This woman did none of those things. Finally, he nodded toward the rope. "Untie her." The overseer hesitated. Cross repeated himself. "Untie her." When her wrists were finally freed, Mara rubbed them slowly but did not step away. Cross spoke again. "You will come with me to Charleston." One of the overseers protested immediately. "She should hang here." Cross turned his head calmly. "And when the court asks why, shall I tell them the master of Whitmore Plantation was alone in a room with a girl he owned?" The overseer fell silent. Reputation was a fragile thing in Charleston. A trial in the city would be dangerous, but an execution without one could be worse. So Mara was placed in chains and loaded into a wagon. As the wheels began to turn toward the road, she looked once toward the distant river. She could not see the oak tree from here, but she trusted that Lena had followed her instructions, that the girl was hidden, that she was alive. The wagon rolled away from Whitmore Plantation, carrying the woman who had broken its silence. History never recorded the exact verdict of Mara's trial. Some accounts say she was imprisoned. Others say she was sold far away so the scandal would disappear quietly. But the plantation itself never returned to what it had been. Because stories move in ways chains cannot stop. Among the enslaved quarters of South Carolina, whispers began to travel. About a mother who had stood in the lantern light and confessed without fear. About a woman who chose her daughter over obedience. The details changed from telling to telling, but the heart of the story remained the same. On one plantation, for one moment, silence had broken. And once silence breaks, it never returns quite the same. Somewhere along the river outside Charleston, a young girl waited beneath an old oak tree as the sky brightened into morning, waiting for footsteps, waiting for news, waiting for a future she could not yet imagine. And far down the road, chained in the back of a wagon, Mara Whitmore sat quietly as the plantation disappeared behind her. She did not cry. She did not beg. Because whatever the courts decided, whatever punishment came next, one truth had already been carved into the history of that land. A mother had refused to step aside, and sometimes that is where history truly begins.